The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things, whatever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and the salutation, 'Rabbi.' As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called Master. You have but one Master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord.
Jesus is really hard on the Pharisees. I mean, I get why he's so mad, but even I'm thinking, wow, those poor Pharisees. I sense that they were just operating out of their deep conviction that society needs laws and structures if it's going to survive. And we get that. Without laws and structures, society would either degenerate into chaos or never grow and mature. I think of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, that I used to use in my poverty and politics class. It was written in 1906, and frankly, it's a tough read. It's this really vivid portrayal of the harsh conditions and exploited lives of immigrants in Chicago in a time when there weren't many rules or laws that protected anybody in the working class. They lived in deep poverty with no unions, no health care, no social supports of any kind, really, and harsh living and working conditions. It paints a society that hadn't developed very far for the good of its people, and one that would take a long time to fix. Indeed, we all know this too well. We're still trying to get it right ourselves. We get this. So should it surprise us that the ancient Jews were so worried about rules and regulations? They just believed that laws and structures were necessary if Israel was to survive and to grow as a nation. There's a scene in the book of Nehemiah, in fact, where the entire nation gathers and dedicates itself to keeping the law. And from that day on, the study of the law in Israel would become one of the most important professions. From there, these ancient lawyers, the scribes, who we hear about all the time in the Gospels, took upon themselves the task of applying the major laws of the land to the tiniest details of everyday life. For example, take the law that said a person could not work on the Sabbath. The scribes spent hours discussing how that law applied to such things as walking. How far could a person walk, for instance, before walking ceased to be recreation and became work? And so there were laws saying that it was all right to walk half a mile on the Sabbath. But anyone who walked beyond that distance broke the law. It's amazing, really. They were actually counting their steps way before it was fashionable. But not to get to 10,000, right? But instead to make sure they didn't do more than 1,000 on a Sabbath day. And as though that weren't enough, the scribes went further. They built fences around the law, if you will, to keep people from breaking the law by accident. In other words, if it was okay to walk a half a mile on Sabbath, why not keep people from breaking the law accidentally? So we'll make it a law that they can only walk 2/5 of a mile on the Sabbath, which is only about 800 steps. By the time this scribal interpretation of the law was finished and every facet of the law was figured out, it took more than 50 volumes to hold the mass of regulations that resulted. Okay, so I'll admit, they got a little carried away. And do you know what the upshot of it all was? Many common people in Israel gave up trying to keep all the laws, because these laws were placed upon them by the scribes and the Pharisees, and they were totally discouraged, these folks. And they gave up even all hope of pleasing God. And as a result, these unfortunate folks were rejected by the Pharisees as sinners and outcasts. It's really this, I think, that explains why Jesus was so hard on them. It was because the Pharisees and the scribes had turned religion into nearly nothing more than a set of rules. It also explains why Jesus says to them in today's gospel, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. In contrast to all this legalism, Jesus holds up love and forgiveness. He is saying the heart of religion is not a book filled with rules that only a few people have the leisure and the learning to keep. Rather, it is a heart filled with love and compassion, a love and compassion that everyone is capable of. In fact, Jesus says it clearly in last Sunday's gospel when he reduces all the commandments of the law to these two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the commandments of the law are subordinate to these two. Jesus seems to be saying that you can make all the laws you want and keep all the laws you make, but if your reason for doing so are other than love of God and love of neighbor, then you've missed the whole point of the law and of religion in the first place. You know, this past week we celebrated All Saints and All Souls, a couple of days in our year that in her wisdom the church gives us to direct our attention toward real life people who offer an example of how to follow rules maybe, but more importantly, who loved like Jesus loved. Each one of us could stack up the saints, canonized or not, whose love has inspired us, or the souls, close to us or not, who have gone before us, many of whom, by example, have taught us how to love. The ones who fill our hearts on those days are the servants who humbled themselves, and because of how they loved us personally, or loved the poor, or the immigrant or outcast, or the unborn, or the sick, or the dying, are now remembered, honored, and even exalted, just as Jesus promised in the gospel today. Friends, it's quite possible that no one in our day has loved more beautifully and more holy than St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta. More than most people ever will, she maintained a beautiful balance between law and love when it comes to the practice of religion and the living of faith. Her example always edified and challenged us, for sure. But the wisdom of her simple words, too, always gave us pause, made us think. Once she spoke about this call of ours to love. Each person's mission is a mission of love, she said. Begin in the place where you are, with the people closest to you. Make your homes centers of compassion and forgive endlessly. And let no one ever come to you without coming away better and happier. And then she said, at the hour of death, when we come face to face with God, we are going to be judged on love. Not how much we have done, but how much love we put into the doing of it. Friends, by all means, we need to follow the rules. But for God's sake, and for our neighbors, we also need to love like crazy along the way.